Hello, today is March 22nd, and today we're going to be reading our first reading for this coming Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent. Our first reading, it comes from Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 through 12. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." And so that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, if you perhaps have looked at some of the other readings you're going to have this week, or if you are aware of what is in our lectionary for this week, I think it would be safe to assume that most people who are going to be preaching on these texts, most people who are going to be reading these texts in worship, this is constructed. Now, this is our Revised Standard Lectionary, the Revised Common Lectionary. This passage from Joshua, which is put here as our first reading, seems not necessarily related. It seems disjointed or disconnected from the rest of the passages that are selected for this day, for this particular Sunday. It is an interesting choice, to be sure, and I would argue that probably most preachers are not going to touch on this section of Joshua when we have a gospel, and our gospel this week is the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. Given how much that is a favorite of many who read the Gospel of Luke, it's very well known. In some ways, it sums up many of the primary themes of Luke, that is, God's loving reconciliation, the sense of social restoration, without imputing any guilt, that is, the father forgiving his son, no matter what had happened between them beforehand. That is one of Jesus's big parables. It's a big deal parable, and so for someone to choose Joshua at the expense of the parable would be an interesting choice. I would like to see the preacher who makes that choice, because this section of Joshua is not necessarily well known. In fact, I would say it's on the periphery of the primary action of Joshua. That is, we have not yet gotten to Jericho. Joshua's the encircling and the collapse of the walls of Jericho, not gotten to the conquest of Canaan and all the theological issues that one can have reading that passage in Scripture, or the resettlement in Canaan at the expense of the local Canaanites. A lot of things in Joshua, and here we have a little snippet from close to the beginning of that story. So we are going to touch on it. We're going to maybe explain or get into the significance of this short passage from it, and maybe even make a connection to the lectionary, the gospel, as we are, or at least I think I'm going to be preaching on, as it kind of makes sense to me. So this reading from Joshua, as I said, it is at the beginning of the book of Joshua, or near the beginning in chapter 5, but it is not at the beginning of our story. Joshua, as you might be aware, is a continuation of the story in the Torah. That is, from the point of Exodus, the beginning of Moses' story, Moses leading the people, or God, that is, leading the people, with Moses as God's messenger, leading the people out of bondage in Egypt into the wilderness. Some 40 years of wandering, of trials, of dangers, idolatry, uh, disease, poisonous snakes, a whole number of challenges that follow the people and test that relationship they have with God. And we follow that from that is in Exodus, that is in Numbers, and then at the end of that journey, or somewhere or in the midst of that journey, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, Moses' the law giving that happens, the establishment of the priests of Aaron, and sort of the codification of who Israel is. That is all connected to that time of in some sense that period of wilderness travel that makes Israel's identity, or underlines Israel's identity, fills out who they are. That is, they are the people of God, defined by the journey that they have been on, and the fact that God continued to be faithful to Israel even through all the challenges of that relationship. So Joshua picks up the story then. The people have journeyed out of Egypt. The people of Abraham and Jacob have left behind bondage. They have traveled through the gamut. They have experienced uncertainty and danger and temptations, and now they are through the wilderness. 40 years, as the narrative goes, have passed, and Moses, prior to this, has died. So we begin. Joshua is our first book that picks up the story. It is not part of the Torah specifically, the first 5 books of the Bible, but instead it is the next book that keeps the narrative going forward. And so this turning point in the story, in which Joshua has been selected as the successor to Moses, the one to lead the people as they come to Canaan and encounter the Canaanites there and come into conflict with them. This story is, in some sense, the moment of turning, in which Israel remembered the Passover. They kept the Passover. As we get towards Holy Week, we will get towards, for Jewish folks, it is the season of Passover, which, as Christians, we remember that Jesus was and is Jewish, celebrated the Passover as his family had done, as his people had done. And here, at this turning point in Joshua and Israel's story, they are celebrating, they are commemorating a particular period. The Passover was the event in which God finally turned the tide for the Israelites in Egypt. That as they were preparing, they were told to prepare to flee. Do not wait for bread to leaven. Do not take too long in packing your things. Be ready to go. And as the story goes, the death of the firstborn is what spurs the final grief of Pharaoh and allows them to leave Egypt. There is a sense of mourning attached to Passover, even as there is celebration. That it took a tragic event, like the death of the firstborn, of the death of all firstborn, for the Israelites to finally gain freedom. And so there is a commemoration of that within the Seder meal itself, a remembrance of the people those who died for the sake of Israel's freedom. And so at this moment of commemoration, now for Israel here at Gilgal, filled with all the meaning of, we thought we knew what hardship was, but then we went out in the wilderness and we experienced it. We went from there and we passed the angel of death passed us over there, and then we passed through the next series of trials. And we got through those too. We got through 40 years of trials. That generation that came out of Egypt, their children are now commemorating that Passover. It's their children who are now with Joshua at Gilgal, remembering what had happened 40 years prior to this. And so they are, I'm sure, the narrative, it gives us this sense of perspective. It is, there is uncertainty about the future, but there's a knowledge about the past. And when it says the Israelites no longer had manna, that is the true turning point, because manna was the symbol. It was the sign of God's presence and continuing commitment to Israel through the wilderness, that they were fed by the grace of God alone, and now that they were in Canaan, God was allowing the produce of Canaan to feed them once again. Because through that story, from the point of the Passover, of the first Passover, through the wilderness to this point, and then into the future, Israel was sustained by God alone. That God alone ensured that his promises were kept. And so Israel, they remembered this, and as they commemorated the faithfulness of God through those 40 plus years, through all that time, the manna stops. But even though the manna stops while they are there in Canaan, they have reached their intended goal by the faithfulness of God. So that's the central melancholy yet celebratory tone of this passage. I think it's a really powerful passage. I think Joshua probably deserves more attention from us as a church, both to question and to find meaning in. All right, I hope you're having a good week. We have our Wednesday service tomorrow. I'll see you later.